Between 2008 and 2022, a series of international consortia in population genetics completed one of the most ambitious scientific undertakings in modern history, sequencing and analyzing the genomes of representative samples from every major human population group on the planet, with a level of precision and scale that had never been attempted before. They mapped deep divergences between populations, traced ancient migration patterns across continents, identified interbreeding events between early human groups, and placed the major archaic admixture components, including Neanderthal and Denisovan contributions that had been suspected for years but were finally being directly confirmed inside the raw data for the first time. By the early 2020s, the consortia had produced what was supposed to be a comprehensive and final picture of the deep genetic origins of every human population on Earth, a framework so thorough and so well supported across multiple independent studies that the scientific consensus treated it as essentially settled and complete. There was one exception, one specific population group whose deep genetic history refused to fit the picture, no matter how the analyses were run, no matter which reference panels were used, and no matter how the parameters were adjusted by the researchers working directly with the data. The samples that produced the anomaly came from specific populations in Central and Inner East Asia, populations whose modern descendants live across regions stretching from the Tarim Basin in the west to the upper reaches of the Amur River in the east. And what these samples showed in the deep genomic layers was something the standard model had no category for. They contained the expected components, the out-of-Africa stream, Neanderthal admixture at standard levels, Denisovan contributions, sometimes higher than typical, and signatures consistent with the deep Northeast Asian source population. But layered underneath all of that was a residual signal that did not match anything in the reference panels the consortia had built. The standard model of human origins that the consortia were working within recognizes 5 major source streams that together account for the genetic variation observed across contemporary human populations, beginning with the deepest African source, dated to around 200,000 years ago, from which all other modern human populations ultimately descend. The second stream is the out-of-Africa migration, dated between 60,000 and 70,000 years ago, that carried a founding population through the Middle East and into Eurasia, followed by Neanderthal admixture through interbreeding events in the Middle East, then Denisovan admixture entering East Asian and Oceanian gene pools, and finally, the deeply diverged basal Eurasian lineage that contributed substantially to West Eurasian populations. These 5 components taken together can account for almost all of the genetic variation observed in living human populations across the entire planet, with African populations dominated by the African source, European populations layered with out-of-Africa and steppe contributions, and Native American populations deriving from a specific subset of the East Asian deep lineage that crossed the Bering Land Bridge in the late Pleistocene. The framework is comprehensive, and it works with remarkable consistency across the global sample, which is exactly what makes the Inner Asian anomaly so scientifically significant, because a model that successfully accounts for every other major population group on Earth and then fails specifically and consistently on one regional cluster is telling you something the model has not yet figured out how to say. The unexplained signal in the Inner Asian samples is not noise, it is not a contamination artifact, and it is not the result of a single study run with flawed methodology, because it is consistent across multiple independent samples from related populations analyzed by different research teams using different analytical approaches at different points in time. Researchers working with these samples have given the unexplained component various technical names, including deep Inner Asian Bose lineage and unsampled archaic contribution, with some proposing it represents a previously unknown population of anatomically modern humans that was present in the Inner Asian continental zone before the major out-of-Africa expansion reached the region.
The contributions are not trivial in magnitude, accounting for between 5 and 12% of the deep genomic ancestry in some samples, depending on the analytical method used, which means the source population that produced this signal was present, was reproductively connected to these ancestral groups and left a measurable and durable genetic legacy that survives in the modern descendants of these populations today. The divergence calculations, the timing implied by the data, the geographic distribution of the contributing lineage, and the structural properties of the contributing lineage all point toward a population that was present in Inner Asia during a period and with a history that the consensus model of human origins does not currently have a place for in its framework. The findings were not announced with a press release, were not the subject of a public scientific communication, and were not incorporated into the textbook version of human origins that universities continue to teach and natural history museums continue to display in their permanent exhibits on human evolution and prehistoric migration. They were buried in the supplementary materials of a series of technical papers that circulate almost exclusively within the specialist community, written in the careful and guarded language of researchers who are aware they are touching something that carries professional risk if it is presented with strong public claims before the field has built consensus around an interpretation. The lead researchers on the relevant projects, when asked directly about the anomalous findings, have given carefully worded responses that acknowledge the existence of the unexplained component, while explicitly declining to speculate about what the component might mean for the broader understanding of human deep history in the Inner Asian continental zone. The consensus model has continued to be taught and presented to the public as essentially complete. The anomalies have continued to sit in the archived data of published papers, and the gap between what the specialist literature actually contains and what the public version of human origin science communicates has quietly grown wider with each passing year.
Other major anomalies in population genetics over the past 2 decades have been openly discussed and incorporated into the consensus without significant institutional resistance, with the Neanderthal admixture finding published and widely discussed in 2010, the Denisovin finding released in the same year to open scientific debate, and the recognition of basal Eurasian as a distinct deep lineage incorporated without major controversy. The unexplained Inner Asian component has been subjected to a demonstrably different institutional treatment, described in technical terms within specialist literature, but never pursued in terms of its broader implications, never connected publicly to questions about what was actually present in the Inner Asian continental interior across the tens of thousands of years before the standard historical narrative begins. The political and institutional reasons for this differential treatment are not mysterious when examined directly, because both the Russian and Chinese states have invested heavily in particular narratives about the deep history of their respective territories, narratives that do not easily accommodate the existence of a complex and continuous pre-state demographic presence across the Inner Asian continental zone. The Western academic establishment has simultaneously operated for decades on the assumption that the Inner Asian zone functioned primarily as a transit corridor between the major source regions of Africa, the Middle East, and East Asia, an assumption that the unexplained genetic component directly challenges, but that the institutional structure of the field has not yet created space to publicly revise. The combination of these sensitivities has produced a specific and identifiable outcome, which is that genetic data is allowed to be published in technically accurate form. The anomalies are acknowledged in specialist language, but the synthesis that would connect the findings to their broader implications for the understanding of Inner Asian deep history is consistently deferred to a future generation of researchers who will theoretically be free from the current institutional constraints. This is not a conspiracy in the dramatic sense, but a systemic pattern in which findings that challenge politically sensitive frameworks are managed through framing rather than suppression, kept technically available in the public archive while being structurally prevented from entering the mainstream scientific conversation, where they would require the consensus to acknowledge its incompleteness.
The data is not hidden. It sits in the public archives of the journals that publish the relevant papers. The supplementary materials containing the actual measurements are available on open-access servers, and anyone willing to read the technical literature and assemble the picture independently can see exactly what the data is showing about the deep population history of Inner Asia. What the assembled picture shows is that the Inner Asian populations carry a genetic signature of an ancient continental presence that the consensus model cannot account for, that this presence was real and reproductively active and left durable contributions to the genomes of modern descendants, and that the standard timeline for how long this region has been populated by complex human groups may need to be substantially revised. The revision, when it eventually comes, will almost certainly be presented as a new scientific breakthrough, rather than as the long-overdue public acknowledgement of evidence that has been sitting in the archived supplementary materials of specialist papers for years, and the original researchers whose careful technical descriptions kept the anomaly alive in the literature will likely receive far less credit than the future consortium that assembles the synthesis into a form the consensus can accept. The fact that the data has been available for years, that the anomaly has been consistently observed across multiple independent studies, and that the implications have been systematically deferred rather than pursued will be quietly forgotten in the narrative of scientific progress, because the institutional system is far more comfortable presenting breakthroughs than admitting that it spent decades managing the framing of findings it already had. What the genetic record is actually showing, when examined without the managed framing, is that the region was populated for far longer and through far more complex interbreeding histories than the textbook timeline currently allows, that the populations of Inner Asia underwent demographic processes involving source streams the consensus model does not include, and that the modern descendants of those populations carry a quiet biological record of an ancient continental presence that the public version of science has not yet incorporated. The deep origins of human populations are not as cleanly decoded as the press releases of the early 2020s announced, and the one population group that resisted the decoding is not a statistical footnote or a methodological artifact, but a genuine signal pointing toward a piece of human deep history that the institutional system has been unable to acknowledge without consequences it is not yet prepared to accept.